lot more about what's in the recently passed IRA, or Inflation Reduction Act, that contains a significant number of boosts for the electric vehicle industry. Most of us have heard some about the incentive program for light duty vehicles and are horribly and righteously confused because it's a very confusing set of provisions. And Alexia will give us her insight and some really good websites to keep current on what a number of the provisions are as interpreted by various agencies, like the all-important IRS in this one, or Department of Energy. And then we'll get into some of the hidden provisions that discuss commercial and industrial incentives. So with that, I'm proud to ask Alexia to visit with us about the IRA, and away you go.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you all today. I know that the IRA is incredibly complicated. So the more that we can understand it, the better we can use it, and the better that we can all reach our goals. I was under the understanding that Hannah might be sharing my slides. Is that right?
Yes. Yes, I've got it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
No problem.
So just while she pulls those up, as Smitty, helpfully, sorry, it's one of those mornings, something stuck in my throat. As Smitty helpfully introduced, what we're going to be talking about today, and Hannah, if you could go to the next slide, that would be great, is just a little bit around the IRA in general, the two consumer credits around clean vehicles, so the new credit and the used credit, as well as the commercial clean vehicle credit, the clean heavy duty vehicle incentive, as well as the range of manufacturing support that's available for businesses. So we can just dive right in. Hannah, next slide, please. So the IRA, as I'm sure you all know, was signed into law by President Biden on August 16th, 2022. It features a wide package of climate and energy provisions. What we're focusing on today is just the EV provisions. The one on this list that we're not talking about is the alternative fueling, refueling station credit. Very mouthy, I know, because Smitty has told me that someone else will be briefing you on that. But if you do need any additional information, I'm happy to provide it afterwards. But the EV provisions are wide and far, and they're intended to help the U.S. shift not only adoption of EVs, but also the supply chains that we use to source materials for those EVs. So just diving right into the first credit, next slide, please, is the clean vehicle credit for new vehicles. This is quite possibly the most exciting one and also the most confusing. So to provide a baseline, the previous EV tax credit, as I'm sure you all know, provided up to $7,500 for the purchase of an EV. Under that credit, manufacturers had a 200,000 vehicle cap, and it could only be claimed on a consumer's taxes for that year. Now that the IRA is law, the previous credit no longer applies in the same way, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. So next slide, please. So the new clean vehicle tax credit, it's now called the clean vehicle credit, because it includes plug-in electric vehicles as well as fuel cell vehicles, which is a change from the previous credit. The credit is still at $7,500, but it's now split into two equal parts, which each have different eligibility requirements. So the two parts are the critical minerals half, as well as the battery components half. In order to be eligible for either half or both halves of the credit, vehicles must also meet overall eligibility requirements. So that would include MSRP caps that are new, final assembly provision, which is also new, and income caps, also new. And we'll dive into each of those in detail. It also eliminates the manufacturer cap, so Tesla and GM will be able to access the credit again, and it applies to new purchased, financed, and leased vehicles. Unfortunately, 2 and 3 vehicles are not eligible for the credit, and only one credit is allowed per vehicle. So next slide, please. So in order to understand the main part of the credit, I think this is the trickiest piece. The first half of the credit that I mentioned is the critical minerals half. In order to meet the critical minerals piece of the requirement, a minimum percentage of critical minerals must be extracted or processed in the US or free trade partner countries or recycled in North America. So that same minimum percentage can come from recycled materials as long as they're recycled in North America. And this would include things like lithium, graphite, nickel, cobalt, all of those, as they say, critical minerals for the development of EV technology. So next slide, please. Accompanying the critical minerals half is the battery components half. If a vehicle meets this half of the requirement, then they're eligible for this half of the credit. So in order to meet the credit, a minimum percentage of battery components must be manufactured or assembled in North America. And you can think of this as like a made in America provision. And I see the question in the chat, what countries are free trade partners? These slides actually have a list of the free trade partner countries linked. So you can review those there. There's at least 20, includes countries like Chile, things like that. So next slide, please. So in terms of additional requirements, the MSRP caps, like I said, a vehicle must fall under or at the following MSRP caps. It's $80,000 for vans, SUVs, and pickup trucks, and $55,000 for other vehicles, which would include, light duty sedans and things like that. One thing to note is that the MSRP caps do not change over time. So these are set for the entire lifetime of the credit. Next slide, please. Additionally, there's a slew of other provisions that a vehicle must meet. In order to be eligible, a vehicle also has to have final assembly in North America. And no parts of the supply chain value will be allowed to come from what we call foreign entities of concern, which includes countries like China and Russia. And there are different, as you can see from the slide, there are different kick-in dates for when the foreign entities of concern provision starts to apply. So for the critical minerals side, it'll take effect in 2025. And for the battery components side, it will take effect in 2024. Next slide, please. So on the consumer side, consumers must also now meet certain eligibility requirements. So consumers must fall at or below the following income caps in order to be eligible to receive the credit. So $300,000 for joint filers, $225,000 for head of household, and $150,000 for single filers. And these, similarly to the MSRP caps, will not change over time, as far as we know right now. Next slide, please. So the exciting thing about one of the changes that they've made to the credit is that there's now a point of purchase option, and this is available by transferring the credit to a registered dealer so that the consumer can apply the credit at point of purchase. Essentially, will allow the credit to function more like a rebate. In order to do that, the dealer is going to have to undergo an entire, registration process with the IRS that they'll be developing guidance on. But the main thing to know on that for now is that transfer of credit will not be allowed until 2024, really to just give the IRS some time to get that program up and moving. So next slide, please. So this is just a summary slide of everything that I've talked about because it can be kind of tricky to understand how things apply. But essentially, this will give you a sense of the certain requirements that a vehicle has to meet in order to be eligible for either both half or one half of the credit. Next slide, please. So this is, I think, probably the thing we've received the most questions on is what do all of these changes mean for us through the rest of 2022 and then beyond? So for the rest of 2022, the previous $7,500 EV tax credit is still available. There are some changes. Well, there's one main change, which is that the final assembly provision I mentioned now applies as of August 16th, 2022, when the IRA became law. So that means that vehicles now must have final assembly in North America to be eligible for what we consider to be the previous credit. So that's $7,500 without being split into two pieces. The thing to note about this is that the manufacturer cap is still active. So through the rest of 2022, Tesla and GM vehicles will not be eligible for the credit. And Toyota, since it hit its sunset date, would only be eligible for 50% of the credit beginning October 1st, 2022. The nice thing is that the MSRP and the income caps do not apply until 2023. And then the battery components and critical minerals provisions also do not apply at this point. Next slide, please. So starting in 2023, that's when the new federal tax credit will replace the previous credit in its entirety. So it'll now be available for all manufacturers and eligible vehicles and consumers through 2032. So that'll mean the battery components and critical minerals provisions will apply, MSRP and income caps will apply, as well as that final assembly provision. Additionally, and we'll talk about this in just a moment, is the used EV tax credit will also be available for eligible vehicles starting in 2023. Next slide, please. So this is just a timeline on when all those dates go into effect. I'm not going to talk about it here to potentially leave some time for questions, but this will be available for you at your reference to just get a visual on what that looks like to help you understand when certain things take effect. Yes, thank you. And then, like Smitty said, this is a list of resources that we've compiled so far that help to understand vehicle eligibility, particularly for consumers as they start to sift through what these changes mean. So there's a breakdown of the credit and transition period rules from the IRS, a list of vehicles with final assembly in North America from the Department of Energy, as well as a VIN decoder to understand where your specific vehicle was built from the Department of Energy. And both of those DOE resources, as far as I understand, should be updated as the credit stipulations are updated. So hopefully we'll have an active ongoing list of eligible vehicles certified by the Department of Energy. The rest of these things are just additional information for people to use at their disposal. Next slide, please. So now on to the clean vehicle credit for used vehicles. So this is an unprecedented tax credit for used vehicles, and it provides either $4,000 or 30% of the sale price of the vehicle, whichever is less. And similarly to the new vehicle tax credit, there is a point of purchase option that will be allowed starting in 2024. There are also income caps for the used vehicle credit. They are different than the income caps for the new vehicle credit. And vehicles must also meet additional price and sale requirements, which we'll talk about in a second. Like I said, the used EV tax credit will be available starting in 2023. Next slide, please. Great. So as you can see here, the vehicle must be at least 2 years old in order to be eligible for a credit, must be under $25,000. It must be sold by a dealer. The nice thing is that there are no additional sourcing requirements. So all of the critical minerals, battery components, final assembly, all that stuff that I talked about earlier, that does not apply to this credit. So these vehicles are a lot more expansive in what they can be. One thing to note is that the income caps are lower for the used vehicle credit. So they're $150,000 for joint return, $112,500 for head of household, and $75,000 for others. And like I mentioned, that's the maximum credit amount there. Next slide, please. So on the commercial side, there is also a revamp of the commercial clean vehicle credit. So what that looks like, next slide, please. What that looks like is for qualified commercial clean vehicles, this will be available from 2023 through 2032, which is really exciting. That's quite a long time to help fleets transition. And there are credit amount caps that are different for different vehicle classes. There are also some additional requirements that we'll talk through, but those requirements do not include battery or mineral sourcing requirements like the new vehicle tax credit for consumers. Next slide, please. So the vehicle requirements are that the plug-in, or it must be a plug-in electric vehicle or a fuel cell vehicle. It must be made by a qualified manufacturer, which is defined in the bill text, and it must be used for business purposes. So a consumer couldn't use this for their own residential uses. The credit caps for vehicles less than 14,000 pounds is $7,500. So that's on par with the consumer credit. And it's $40,000 for vehicles over 14,000 pounds. So that can help to take a significant chunk of money off for fleets looking to transition. The credit amount is calculated at 30% of the sales price, or what they call the incremental cost of the vehicle, whichever is less. And that incremental cost is essentially the difference in price between the clean vehicle, the qualified clean vehicle in question, and its comparable gas or diesel version. Next slide, please. So there's also a clean heavy duty vehicle incentive. Next slide. This is a $1 billion with a B, $1 billion rebate program for clean heavy duty vehicles. This includes class 6 and 7 vehicles only. Eligible entities to apply for this rebate program are states, municipalities, Indian tribes, or nonprofit school transportation associations. And the rebates can be used for a variety of different functions, and up to 100% of the cost for these things. So it could be replacing a gas vehicle with a ZEV. It could be anything around infrastructure needed to power that ZEV. And it could be workforce development and training to support the operation of that vehicle. Additionally, it can include planning and technical activities to support further adoption of ZEVs. So there's quite an expansive definition of what you can use this funding for, which is really great, and allows us to think through some additional options on how we can support adoption. Next slide, please. So on the manufacturing credits and support slides, I will admit this is not necessarily my area of expertise. So if you start to ask me lots of detailed questions, we'll poke a few holes in the facade. But I'll do my best to give you a brief on the manufacturing side as well. So there are a few different manufacturing credits. The first is the Advanced Manufacturing Production Credit. This is a credit for manufacturing clean energy technologies. So this includes a range of technologies. Why it's included in the EV section is that it includes battery components and critical minerals as clean energy technology. The credit amount is calculated differently depending on the type of technology. It's calculated on the value of the materials and the build for that year. So I didn't include it here, but if you're interested in that, I'd suggest looking at the bill text for additional information. And one thing to know is that production, in order to be eligible for this credit, production must take place in the US or in US territories. And this will be available starting in 2023. So this is a big part of how the IRA is working to pull US supply, or our supply chain onshore to US territory. Next slide, please. Another way to help support the manufacturing side is through the Advanced Technology Vehicle Manufacturing Program. And there were $3 billion, again with a B here, $3 billion appropriated for this program. And this program provides loans for re-equipping, expanding, or establishing a manufacturing facility in the US to produce essentially advanced technology vehicles, which includes EVs as well as fuel cell vehicles. It's for light duty vehicles only. So this would be, quite a large support for our friends over at Ford, GM, Tesla, and all the other OEMs. And something to note is that light duty vehicles for the manufacturing credit is a more expansive definition of clean vehicle. So this could include, based on my read of it, this could even include regular hybrid vehicles. So this is not necessarily limited to plug-in electric or fuel cell vehicles based on how we understand it at the moment. Next slide, please. This is the last manufacturing incentive that I'll be talking about, and this is the domestic manufacturing conversion grants. Essentially, this is $2 billion and it's been appropriated for grants of domestic production of lots of different types of clean vehicles. Again, this is a more expansive definition of clean vehicle. You'll see here, of course, that hybrid is on that list. So not necessarily just plug-in vehicles. And it supports retooling existing auto manufacturing facilities to help manufacture what they call clean vehicles under this definition. And the funding for this is available through 2031. I know that I just ran through that very quickly. I believe that was my last slide, Hannah, unless I'm wrong. I'm happy to take any questions. I wanted to leave a little time for questions because I know it's a lot of information and it could be very confusing. So let me know if that works for you, Smitty.
Yep, I think it's a great time for questions, and I know there are probably a lot of people out here who have questions on something this complex.
Fantastic. Well, Philip, if that's a hand for a question, I'm happy to take that one first.
Awesome, cool. Yeah, thank you. That's great run through everything. On the heavy duty vehicle rebate program, how is that administered? Is that like what agency oversees those rebates and that process?
I believe the rebate program is through the DOE loans office.
Okay, thank you. And then in general, it seems like that's what most of this stuff, and I'm saying this is a bad idea, but like this is all being done through federal programs, federal agencies, et cetera. Like this is the kind of thing, other big spending bills, sometimes you pass money onto the states and they administer. It seems like wholly the feds are holding on to these dollars and you kind of go straight through them. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's what it looks like. Some areas where I would say that that's definitely going to become a point of contention are when you talk about the kind of dealer involvement. So thinking about the consumer credits, the consumer credits are only eligible if the vehicles are sold via dealers, especially on the used side. And because dealers are licensed often at the state level, but these are running through the federal level, we envision there might be some challenges with making sure those things align. But generally your read is right, is that the money flows solely through the feds and then is passed on to consumers or businesses that way.
Okay, thank you.
And then I see this question in the chat from Alice on if countries where most lithium is sourced from, like Chile exclusions, does that mean the impact is mostly on battery manufacturing and vehicle assembly? So I just want to clarify that really quickly. Chile is actually not excluded because it's a free trade partner of the US. So that's a positive. But yes, you have arrived on the, I would say the part of the trickiest part of the Inflation Reduction Act and the changes to the credits is that essentially they close down options for using the most common providers of these materials, countries like Russia, China. So it certainly will be a supply chain challenge that we're going to be looking at for the next couple of years. Smitty, I don't know if that's a question for me.
Yes, I have a couple of them. One of the things that has been of some conversation amongst members of our group has been, how is the dealer going to get money that goes to you for a tax incentive? In other words, I'm assume that I will not qualify for a tax incentive this year, but might next year. But that isn't going to be determined until whenever I file my taxes 2 years down the line, or in April of 24 for a 23 purchase. So how are they going to figure out whether or not you qualify for a tax incentive? Do you know, is there who's going to figure all that out? Do you have any idea on that?
So the short answer is that they don't really know. The official answer is that the IRS has been directed to process all of this. Of course, you've outlined the main challenge is that, you won't know for sure until potentially 12 months later whether or not you're actually eligible based on your tax returns. What I have heard is that some people are suggesting that they're going to use the previous year's tax returns or even the previous 2 years tax returns. But in terms of income verification, of course, that can't come from the dealer. So there is, I think, quite a lot of work the IRS needs to do when they develop the guidance around processing these credits to make sure that they're providing ample information in a structure so that income verification runs privately through the IRS.
Okay. And are there other questions? I have another one if there are no others.
Smitty, I have a question. What if you satisfy all the requirements except your tax liability, except you have no tax liability, can you still get the tax credit? Pretty clear?
This is a really good question. And I think under the previous tax credit rules, this would be a lot easier to answer because previously we were able to, tell folks to lease the vehicle. Now leasing is subject to the same income requirements. So I actually don't have a clear answer for you at the moment. What I can do is get in touch with Plug-in America's team internally to see if we can turn back around something for you on that.
That would be great. And I also have the question that Greg has in the chat, which is the used credit, or actually for me, used or new, is it limited to individuals or consumers? I mean, can it be a business that applies for it, for the light duty incentive?
My understanding is that the used credit is limited to consumers and that any businesses should be trying to get tax breaks through the commercial credit.
Thank you.
Any further questions?
Oh, sorry, Smitty. One thing that I should have said is there are a lot of problems with the changes that they've created for the tax credits. So you should certainly expect that the credits could undergo some changes either at the end of this year, or even next year, as we start to really feel out what this is going to look like on the ground. So I would say this is by no means the final version of what we'll see, and this could definitely change in the next couple of months, which adds another layer of complexity.
Great. And I think that's a very good place to end. Is our local Congressman Lloyd Doggett has indicated to me he expects that there will be provisions in a cleanup bill for this and several other measures passed this year by the end of the calendar year. So stay tuned is a good way to put it. And now I'd like to ask you, if you would, to make a pitch for Plug-in America and to explain for those who don't know what Plug-in America is and how people can participate.
Sure. So Plug-in America, we're very proud to be the voice of the EV consumer. So we represent consumer interests nationwide and at the state level to make sure that everyone can get into an EV and experience the benefits of a clean vehicle. So the way that you can engage with Plug-in America is you can sign up to become a member. We leverage our members across the nation to help us advocate for supportive policy. And they're really fired up bunch. I mean, as I'm sure you all know in this space, EV drivers and climate folks tend to be pretty passionate people. So they are a very fired up bunch. We're happy to support them. And I'm happy to drop a link in the chat on how you can sign up to become a member, to receive our newsletter, and stay up to date with what we're doing.
And could you mention your Plug Share and Plug Star products too?
Yes. So on the education side, We have what we call PlugStar, which is a tool that helps you find vehicles that work for you. It can help you sift through available incentives at the federal, state, and even sometimes the local level, as well as some utility incentives that might be available in your area. So it's really a really great consumer tool where you can, as an individual, go and put in what it is you're looking for, and the program will help you find that matching vehicle. Additionally, we have what we call the EV support program, which is a hotline number that you can call with any questions about EVs or charging or using an EV, anything about that experience, buying an EV, whatever it might be. So please feel free to either use that support program yourself or share it with your constituents for their use.
Thank you so very much. And I'm very proud of Alexia. And I serve on the board of Plug in America, and she's a great example of the quality of staff that is throughout Plug in America. And I want to thank you for taking time to be with us and all the good work you do. So,
well, thank you all for your attention. I appreciate it, and I really appreciated the invitation. It's a great way to spend a Friday afternoon.